Well, yeah, Miss Jimmy said, Brother Croft, your seat's up here where you can hear better. So, all right then. So, if you have your Bible, turn to 2 Kings chapter number 19. 2 Kings chapter number 19, and I'm going to start reading in verse 21. We went over verse 21 last week, but it's going to be a refresher. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee and laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee. Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed, and against whom hast thou exalted thy voice, and liftest up thine eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel? By thy messengers thou hast reproached the Lord, and hast said, with the multitude of my chariots I am come up to the height of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon, and will cut down the tall cedar trees thereof, and the choice fir trees thereof, and I will enter into the lodgings of his borders, and into the forest of his Carmel. I have digged and drunk strange waters, and with the sole of my feet have I dried up all the rivers of besieged places. Hast thou not heard long ago how I have done it, and of ancient times that I have formed it? Now have I brought it to pass that thou shouldest be to lay waste fenced cities into ruinous heaps. Therefore their inhabitants were of small power, they were dismayed and confounded, they were as the grass of the field, and as the green herb, as the grass on the housetops, and as corn blasted before it be grown up. But I know thy abode, and thy going out, and thy coming in, and thy rage against me, because thy rage against me, and thy tumult is come up into mine ears. Therefore will I put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way by which thou camest. And this shall be a sign unto thee. Ye shall eat this year such things as grow of themselves, and in the second year that which springeth of the same. And in the third year sow ye and reap and plant vineyards and eat the fruits thereof. And the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall yet again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, they that escape out of Mount Zion. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this. Therefore thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way which he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for mine own sake, and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose in the morning, when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. I'm going to stop reading right there. So again, we went over this. We've been going over this for several weeks now, but we got to this point right here last week where everyone has kind of had their say in this situation. Hello, Brother Parks. How y'all doing? But everyone has had their say in this situation. I mean, if you think about it, Rabshakeh has had his say in this situation. Sennacherib's had his say in this situation. The men that Hezekiah sent out to listen to Rabshakeh whenever he was talking, the men on the wall have their opinions. And finally, Hezekiah, takes his prayer. They send a message to Isaiah. Isaiah has a say in the situation, and so finally, Sennacherib sends a letter up to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah takes the letter, which is what we talked about last week. He takes that letter down and he just presents it before the Lord, and he presents it, and so now we're finally going to get the person who matters. The person who matters, they're going to have their say, and that's God. And I thought about how in my life, I mean, you get input from so many people sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with good godly counsel. There's nothing wrong with getting multiple opinions. I mean, we all have decisions we face in our life. I talked to Brother Randy about some possible changes I have that that I could have at my job, and I'm like, hey, help me pray about this. But ultimately, and I'll just bring that situation up. And I've had conversations. I've had conversations with my branch manager. I've had conversations with the regional manager. I've had conversations with someone, that's not part of that, but another job that I had an opportunity to take. I've had those conversations, Brother Parks, and I've listened to their input, and I've given my stuff. But ultimately, the one person I need to hear from is God. The one person I need to say, hey, this is what I want you to do is God, and I can reference many examples where I took someone else's advice and didn't seek God's advice. Someone else, and I'm like, hey, that person's really smart. That person's really smart. I think I'm just going to do what they say. And I go do what they say. And guess what? It wasn't because it was bad advice. It was because I didn't seek God and bring Him into the matter and look for Him and try to find His will in the matter. And I wanted to do, I was like, hey, that makes sense. I'm just going to do it. And so I learned the hard way. I learned the hard way that the best way, whether it looks like it's the best way or not, to these eyes, is to do whatever God's telling me to do. It is to do whatever God's telling me to do. I tell the story. I told it a bunch, but when I was a teenager, Brother Croft, I had a pretty nice truck. And y'all forgive me, but I watched this television show, and this television show had this super cool Dodge pickup truck on it. And so I watched that show, and I'm like, man, I want one of those trucks. I want one of those trucks. And so, Brother Parks, I just got to wanting one of those trucks, and one day I'm riding around. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to pull into the automobile dealership. I'm just going to pull in, and I'm just going to see what they got to say. And so, I'm 19, maybe I'm 20 years old. I think maybe I was 20. Yeah, I was 20. So I was 20 years old and pulled in there, and I pulled in, and the guy I wanted to see was busy, and the other guy come out, and I'm just walking around looking at them. It was when Dodge changed from they had the same body style from like 1974 to 1993 or something. I mean, they had the exact same body style. Every one of them trucks looked exactly the same. Then they changed in 94 to that the newer rounded body style. And so I'm there, I'm walking around, I'm looking, and the guy comes out, he said, hey, you want to drive one? So I'm like, well, yeah, sure. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll look at your truck, and I'll see how much we'll give you for your truck, and you just take that thing off and drive it. So I did. I got in that thing, and I took off and drive it, and my truck was $4,000 away from being paid for, Miss Jimmy. It was $4,000 away from being paid for. And I drove that truck, and I drove it up there, and I drove it back, and I come back, and we sat down, and he's like, well, we're going to offer you this much for your truck. We're going to give you this much. And it was more than what I was expecting they were going to give me. And then I already knew, because, they had the sticker price, which I wasn't even smart enough to know to negotiate down from the sticker price, Brother Croft. And, here's the price. And so, it was a pretty good deal. It was a pretty good deal. And there was just one problem. When I went there originally, I went there to look at a used truck. I went there because they had a used, it was just a Dodge Dakota. It was extended cab. The guy that I worked with, his wife worked at the dealership, and she's like, look, it's a one-owner trade-in. It's only got like 30,000 miles on it. He doesn't want that much money for it. And it would have been an even-up trade, my truck for that used truck. But I test drove that new truck. And so we sat down, and next thing you know, it was a bam, 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 bam. And I'm like, I'm already like going through, and I'm like, man. And I leave the place, and the bank was closed, so they were going to check with the bank. And so I'm like, and I knew I was riding down the road, and I was praying about it, and God said, you don't need that truck. I was like, well, okay, and I'm like, but I've already negotiated a price and everything, and he's like, you don't need that truck. And so then here's where I made my mistake, Brother Parks. I said, well, all right, God, here's the deal. All right, if the loan goes through, because I never had a loan for, I didn't have any credit. The other was on my dad's. And so I was like, well, if the loan goes through, then it's your will. And he's like, no, it's not my will. You don't need that truck. And so so Monday morning rolls around, I get a phone call. It's the guy that I work with, it's his wife. She said, come get your truck. And I'm like, oh, no. And again, I should have just said, look, I'm sorry. But I'm sorry. I appreciate everything. She said, look, the lady at the bank didn't want to give you a loan. But I talked to her, and I convinced her for you to get this loan. And Brother Parks, I tried to justify it. We'll say, well, you know what? That was God working it out. It wasn't God working out. He'd already told me no. And so I went down, and I traded my truck in, and I should have just said, look, I don't want that truck. I can have that truck over there, but I can't have this truck. And traded that truck in, and within 8 months of me buying that new truck and extending my payments out for 5 years, I moved to Georgia. I could have had my old truck paid for and moved to Georgia with a paid-for truck, but instead I moved to Georgia owing 5 years on a brand new truck. And Brother Parks, I kicked myself once I moved down here because, it's easy to make $500-600 a month payment when you live at home with your mom and dad, but when you move down here and you're paying for, you're paying rent, and you're paying this, and you're paying that, you're paying everything, it was a whole nother story. And I forever kicked myself because I'm like, why? Why did I not just listen to God? Why did I let any of these other, my dad was like, it's fine. And some other people were like, oh, that's going to be a cool truck. It didn't matter if it's a cool truck. It didn't matter how cool the truck was going to be. God said no. God said no, and I could have had that other truck and it would have been paid for, rolled down here with a paid-for truck and lived happily ever after. Instead, I rolled down here with a truck that, that had a $500 a month payment attached to it, and then I didn't realize that when I moved down here, I was going to be getting married as quick as I was going to get married. And then I had another choice to make. I was like, well, I can pay this big payment on this truck, or I can take the money that I'm making and get married. And so I had to sell my truck. And it killed me to have to sell my truck, but it taught me a lesson. It taught me a lesson that, hey, when God says no, it means no. When God says don't do this, guess what? It's just either say, I don't know why he's saying don't do this, but I'm just not going to do it. I don't understand, I could make $300 a month payment when I lived at home was easy, and it was $200 for insurance, which doesn't sound like a lot, now, but back 25 years ago, $200 a month was ridiculous for insurance, and as I'm paying $500 a month for this stupid truck. And it was fine. I lived at home. I'd never even crossed my mind when I bought that truck that within a year I'd be moved to, actually within 8 months I'd be living in Georgia. Never even crossed my mind. But guess what? God knew I was not going to be there. God knew every bit of that. And he's like, hey, you don't need this truck. And I'm like, yeah. And I talked God into something, and I didn't talk God into something. He allowed me to make a mistake in my own life because I said, I'm going to do it. And so here in this situation, we finally have God chiming in on the situation. We finally have God. Again, like I said, Hezekiah could have said anything he wanted to. Sennacherib has said anything he wanted to. Rabshakeh surely said everything he wanted to and then some. But now God is speaking. And so we went over last week how that at the very beginning, and again, when you go through these verses, at one point God's talking to Sennacherib, and another point God's talking to Hezekiah, and so it kind of bounces around a little bit right here. But at the very beginning, when God is talking to Sennacherib, he basically tells him, he said, the virgin, the daughter of Zion, has despised thee and laughed thee to scorn. He said, you think you're big, you think you're bad, you think you're something. Guess what? Those people sitting inside that wall, they're not scared of you. They're not afraid of you. They've laughed you to scorn. They think it's hilarious that you have challenged their God, that you've challenged their God. You've picked a fight that you can't win, and you think in your mind that you can win this fight. And so you get down to verse number 22. He says, "Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed?" He said, you thought you were challenging the men of Judah. You thought you were challenging Hezekiah. You thought you were just huffing and puffing and going to threaten to blow their house down and make them nervous because you talked about all the other gods of all the other lands that you've conquered. Well, guess what? I took it as a personal affront to me. I took it as you called out me. You called out God. And you ever seen that? I mean, sometimes when I was a kid, there would be little disagreements in the neighborhood. We had one of those yesterday when we went on church visitation. There was a pretty big disagreement in the neighborhood. It was a little entertaining, but it was also extremely sad. They were having them a knockdown, drag out, screaming fight. And Brother Jay, I said, this is something Levi never heard. He never heard his mom and dad argue, but never happened. It didn't happen. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, you have here where they're like, he called out God. And when I was a kid, sometimes the neighbor kids would start challenging each other, and then we had one boy. My sister, her and my mom should be watching this. She'll enjoy this reference right here. But we had one boy, and he was a big old boy, and he was a big old boy. But he was one of those guys that would pick a fight, but he never really wanted to fight. And so he had an older brother named Georgie. And anytime he got in any kind of trouble, that's what you heard. I'm going to go get Georgie. I'm going to go get Georgie. And so he would start something, and next thing you know, I'm going to get Georgie. And so we all kind of made fun of him because he was always going to get Georgie. But here he picked a fight and didn't realize that, hey, Hezekiah had something he was going to be able to depend on. Hezekiah wasn't dependent on his army. He wasn't dependent on himself. He wasn't dependent on his own military wisdom. He wasn't dependent on anything but God. And once he brought God in, guess what? Hezekiah's like, well, this is going to be interesting. As soon as he hears, again, you have to remember that this is God speaking to Hezekiah, but he's is explaining, hey, this is what's going on. God is explaining to Hezekiah because he laid that letter on the altar and said, God, do you see this? Have you heard this? And so here is God speaking to Sennacherib. He said, whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed, and against whom hast thou exalted thy voice and lifted up thine eyes? He's like, you thought it was Hezekiah, but no, you also talked about Hezekiah's God. Don't you trust? He told Hezekiah, don't you trust in your God? If you remember, Rabshakeh said, hey, don't you let Hezekiah deceive you into trusting in God. But Sennacherib said, don't be fooled by trusting in your God. And so he said, you've called me out. You've called me out. In verse 23, he said, by thy messengers you've reproached the Lord. And you remember when Rabshakeh was talking, I mean, he was just going on, and he didn't matter what was coming out of his mouth. He didn't care. And he would just say whatever. He was calling them all out. And he told, remember, he said, I'm speaking, so the men on the wall, they're like, hey, speak in your own language, for we understand it, not the Jews' language. And he said, oh, no. He told them what they were going to drink and what they were going to eat. If you remember, he's like, this is what you're going to drink. This is what you're going to eat. I'm speaking for them to hear. Because Hezekiah is trying to deceive them into trusting their God, and their God is not going to be able to save them. And they named off this God and that God and this God and that God. And Sennacherib, even whenever he did it, he said, I've destroyed, in verse 12, he said, have the gods of the nations delivered them, which my fathers destroyed, as Gozan and Haran and Rezeph and the children of Eden, which is in Telassar. And then he goes into verse 13. He says, look, I'd take them gods that they trusted in, and he said, I'd cut them apart and burn them. And he said, your God's the same way. Your God's the same way. And God said, he said, by your messengers, you've called me out. You put a challenge to me. He said, with the multitude of my chariots, and this is Sennacherib in his great swelling words, with the multitudes of my chariots, I am come up to the height of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon. And so again, so now here, this is God interpreting, what Sennacherib said. This is God interpreting what Sennacherib said. And he said, you said, hey, I've got so many chariots and I've got so much power. There's no mountain too high for me. There's no mountain. My army is so great. There's no obstacle that you can put in my way that I cannot overcome. You say, hey, look at that mountain right there. No man's ever scaled that mountain. Sennacherib said, oh yeah, watch and see what I'm about to do. Sennacherib said, I'll take my army, I won't just scale that mountain, I'll take my chariots to the top of that mountain. I'll put my chariots on top of that mountain and look down on that mountain and say, look what I have done. Everything about Sennacherib was a look what I have done. And so he said, with the multitude of my chariots, he said, I'm come up to the height. There is no height too high for me. And so he said, and I will cut down the tall cedar trees thereof and the choice fir trees thereof. He said, look, there's again, like I said, there's no obstacle that can stop me. You say, hey, look at those trees, they're humongous. I'm not worried about big trees. I'll cut those trees down. Look at those trees, they're majestic. I don't care about the majestic of the fir tree. I don't care about that. I'll take those trees down as well. There is nothing that can get in my way, was his attitude. There is nothing that can stop me. I am all powerful. And there is nothing that will get in my way. There is no one capable of stopping me. He said, in the choice fir trees thereof, and I will enter into the lodgings of his borders and into the forest of his Carmel. He said, look, I'm coming for him, and when I get there, he's not going to stop me. He said, I'll just march right in. Those mountains are not an obstacle to me. Those trees are not an obstacle to me. I will march right in, and when I march in, I'll march right into his lodgings. I will enter into the forest of his Carmel. I'll take the fruits of his field from him. They're mine. That's what he was saying. Sennacherib said, hey, those are mine. Those are mine, and you will not stop me. In verse number 24, he said, I have digged and drunk strange waters. He said, look, put me out, send me across the desert. I'm not scared of a desert. He said, I'll dig a well. He said, I've digged and drunk strange waters, and with the sole of my foot, I've dried up all the rivers of besieged places. He said, these people, they have these cities, they have these towers, and they think they're protected, and they think, oh, we've got water coming in, we'll be fine. He said, I stopped those waters up. He said, not only am I not scared to go to a place that has no water, because I'll just dig till I get water, but you send me to a place that thinks they're protected because they have water, and I'll stop that water up. He was pretty big in his own eyes. In verse number 25, again, we change here. We change because now God says, hey, God said, hast thou not heard? God said, hast thou not heard? He said, I've heard what you're saying, Sennacherib, and a lot of what you're saying is true, but he's going to tell him here in a minute the only reason it's true is because I let you do it. But he said, hey, and again, I said it last week, but I believe it, that every man in the heart understands. They may not fully understand, but there is something about them that knows that God is God. Even people that haven't heard the gospel, they're supposed to be able to look around just in the firmament and see that God is real and God is God. And so he said, hast thou not heard? He said, I know when you went into these other cities, but they weren't gods at all. They weren't gods at all. There was no evidence that these other gods, that these nations trusted in, there was zero evidence. Yes, people worshiped them. Yes, people sacrificed to them. But there was zero proof that they had any power whatsoever. There's zero proof. There was nothing that they'd ever done that could say, hey, look, their God did this for them, or their God did that for them. But guess what? Sennacherib, I know you've heard. I know you've heard about me. I know you've heard what I have done. I know that you heard how that the Jews came out of Egypt. I know how you've heard that the Jews came across on dry land. I know that you've heard how they've taken over cities without just marching around the city and the walls fall down. He said, haven't you at least heard about me? I mean, wouldn't you have said, hey, look, maybe a God that make the Red Sea, part the waters of the Red Sea and let millions of people walk across the Red Sea on dry land. Maybe I shouldn't call him out. Maybe a God that takes a little lad with a 5 smooth stones and a sling and take down a giant from the Philistine army that had never been defeated before, maybe that's not the God that I want to challenge. He said, haven't you heard? Again, and just haven't you heard? He's also saying, was it really smart what you've done? I mean, was it really that intelligent? I mean, I know you got the big head. I know you kind of got wrapped up in some things. I know Rabshakeh got wrapped up in some stuff. But Sennacherib, I kind of expected you to be a little more intelligent than what you was. And I was using you to do some things. But, I mean, couldn't you have seen that I was using you to do some things? He said, hast thou not heard long ago? He said, you just got your little recent past. But he said, I created this earth that you're on. I created this earth that you're trying to conquer. He said, long ago, how I have done it. And of ancient times that I have formed it. He said, look, I mean, you're talking about, hey, I'm not scared to climb that mountain. God's like, I made that mountain. I'm not scared of them trees. God's like, I made those trees. You're talking about, hey, I'm not scared of this little thing or that little thing. God's like, I'm not either, because I'm the one that made it. I made it. And again, my father-in-law preached that message. He saw this day, that day. Well, guess what? God knew that one day Sennacherib was going to be, and he knew exactly what he was going to use him for. And he's like, hey, Sennacherib, I saw this day coming before you were ever even created, before you were ever even thought about, before there was any possibility of you being king. I knew this day was coming. And he said, I have done it, and of ancient times that I have formed it. Now have I brought it to pass that thou shouldest be to lay waste fenced cities into ruinous heaps. Again, we read Isaiah chapter 10. I'm not going to go back there this morning. But God just told him, he said, I knew this day was coming. And I knew that I was going to use you, and I was going to allow you to do what you did. But always understand that it was not you that had the power. It was always me. It was always me. And again, I mean, you're going to see it. We're going to see it in maybe not next week, but maybe the week after. We're going to see it that even in Hezekiah's life, Hezekiah gets the big head. Hezekiah lets pride come into his life. And so even it could come into any of our lives. It could come into any of our lives. And God, that's what is one of the things God doesn't like, a proud look. He does not want us to be, I tell you what, best there ever was. I'm the best there ever was. Well, guess what? If you are the best there ever was, because again, somebody has to be the best. If you are the best there ever was, you're only the best there ever was because God allowed you to be the best there ever was. You could lose it in a moment. In a moment. I know Miss Jimmy had a stroke, but you think, I heard someone was very young the other day. They were like in their 20s, and they had a stroke. Just a moment, Brother Jay, just bam. I went from the biggest, the brightest, the strongest, and the baddest, and bam, I had a stroke, and guess what now? Half my body doesn't work anymore. I'm not the biggest, the baddest, the strongest, or anything else. I'm just... And so you understand, in a moment. And so we have to be careful that we never let pride come in and be like, oh, look what I've built. Look what I've done. And it happens. Like I said, but you have to always acknowledge, God, you have allowed this. God, you have gotten me to the place where I'm at. God, you have let me. God, for me, as a technician for many years, Brother Jay, there were times, there were problems that I hadn't been trained. It wasn't something I was trained on. It wasn't something anyone else had any experience on. I could call other people. They don't have any idea. Sometimes you just pray about it. I was talking to someone the other, it was one of the guys I work with, and he had a problem with a sales call, and he said, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night trying to figure out how to solve this issue. I said, I don't deal with it as much as I used to, but I'm like, I used to wake up in the middle of the night, and sometimes God would show me in the middle of the night, hey, this is what you need to do. And I had a problem one time down in Atlanta, and I worked on it. I worked on it up and way into the night. And I'm reading the wiring schematic, and now my eyes are bad. That's why I can't read the wiring schematic. But back then, my eyes weren't as bad, but before long, everything was just going like this. I'm like, look, I've looked at this wiring schematic and looked at this wiring schematic till everything just all jumbled together. My brain is no longer functioning. I can be here for 6 more hours. I'm not going to figure this out. So the guy's like, that's fine if you'll come back in the morning. Went home, went to bed, praying about it, woke up in the middle of the night. God told me what it was, drove right down to the job site. Didn't have to pick up the wiring schematic, Brother Parks. Didn't have to pick up anything. Walked right to what God said, this is what the problem is. Went right over to it, bam, bam, bam. And next thing you know, it's running, and they're looking at me like, what was that? I'm like, what happened? God showed me. God showed me what it was. And it wasn't me. It was because I had this great intellect. It wasn't because I had anything. But I just, you don't learn to depend on God. But you don't ever want to get to the point where you're like, well, guess what, God? Thank you for getting me to this point. Guess what? I don't need you anymore. But if you're not careful, you're like, oh, God, I'm struggling to pay my bills. I'm struggling to make this. I'm struggling to make this payment. I'm struggling to do that. Next thing you know, you come in a little bit of money, and guess what? Guess who you don't need? God goes back to the co-pilot seat. God goes back to the spare tire. And it's a shame. It's a shame that it happens, but you see it happen. And so God said, hey, I want you to understand, now have I brought it to pass that thou shouldest be to lay waste fenced cities. God said, I'm the reason why you were as successful as you were. I'm the reason. He said, therefore their inhabitants were of small power. They were dismayed and confounded. They were as the grass of the field and as the green herb, as the grass on the housetops, and as corn blasted before it be grown up. God said again, he said, it was me. I'm the one that made those people small to you. I'm the one that made them easy prey for you. I'm the one that allowed you to defeat those people. It was me all the time. Verse 27, but I know thy abode. and thy going out and thy coming in, and thy rage against me. Again, we read that also in Isaiah chapter number 10. God said, look, he said, I used you, but you were just a tool. And now the tool has decided that the tool was more intelligent and stronger and more powerful than the person that was using the tool. I used you and you were a tool, but now, he said, I know where you live. I know where you live. I know where you lay your head down at night. And I know your rage against me. Brother Croft, it wasn't just, hey, I know that you're taking the credit for stuff I have done. No, God said, I know. He said, you rage against me. You're like a rabid dog. You're just foaming at the mouth. You know, if someone brings up the God of Israel, it puts him in a rage. It just sends him over the edge. Brother Parks, it sends him into this terrible rage, this frightening rage. God said, he said, I know you. I see you. I see you. I heard you. You know, this wasn't in what you said to Hezekiah, but guess what, Sennacherib? God said, I want you to know that I know. I just want you to know that I know. You think, and I'm sure I've told y'all this before, but my dad was one of those people that he kept me out of a lot of trouble. I didn't get a lot of spankings when I was a kid. I needed a lot more than what I got. I needed a whole lot more than what I got. My sister needed more than me, but anyway, I needed more than what I got. But my dad was one of those people, Brother Jay. He owned 2 gas stations in town, and he owned a trucking company, and it was a small town, and everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew my dad, and because everyone knew my dad, everyone knew me. And so because, like I said, my dad owned his own business, Brother Croft, so I just rode around with him. I went to work with my dad. I went down when he went to the truck places, I went to the truck places. When we went to the gas station places, I went to the gas station places. I just rode around with him. I played in retread shops. I used to climb on top tires while he's in there wheeling and dealing on retreads. I'm climbing across tires in the retread shop. And everyone knew me. And because everyone knew me, Brother Jay, if I did anything, by the time I got home, my dad already knew it. And like, if once I got my driver's license, I would walk into a store. I walk in a store, a town 30 miles away, and they're like, hey, your dad needs you to call. I didn't even tell him I was coming down here. How did he know? I mean, he had GPS on me before GPS was even thought about. The military should have talked to him because he had GPS. And my dad's truck driver said, I don't know how he does it, but he'll find us. And so, but I mean, he kept me out of all kinds of trouble. Why? Because Brother Jay, I knew he was going to know. And if you know, I mean, as a child, if you know your dad's going to know, guess what, boys? Y'all go do it if you want to, but I am not doing it. I'm not doing it because as soon as I do it, somebody's going to tell my dad. And as soon as they tell my dad, then I'm going to have to answer to him. I told y'all about the time where me and my buddy, we riding with his older brother and his friend, and they take us to a bar. They take us to a bar, and they go in, and they weren't drinking, Brother Parks. They were just shooting pool. And we sit out there, me and my buddy, we sit out in the car because we're not going in. We sit out there. We didn't go in and play pool. We didn't go in. And finally I got tired of sitting in there, and I'm like, I'm going in there, and I'm telling them I want to go home. So I go in there, tell them I want to go home, and then they come, they finish their round of pool, and they come out, and they take us home. And that night, my dad's like, where was you today? Well, and he's like, did you go to a bar? Yes, I went to a bar, but I'm like, he already knew. He already knew, Brother Parks. And so it was a good thing for me. And it's a good thing for me once I got saved to understand God, and I don't mean this irreverently, but God was like my dad. He already knew. He already knew. You can't hide stuff from God. You can't sneak around and be like, hey, I'm going to say this in private and God's not going to hear. God knew you were thinking it. God knew you were thinking it. God knew your thoughts. God knew you were going to think it before you did think it. And so he tells Sennacherib, he said, look, I know thy abode, and thy going out, and thy coming in, and thy rage against me. Because thy rage against me, and thy tumult, your pride, is come up into mine ears. Therefore, he said, because of this, therefore, I'll put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way by which thou camest. Again, for Sennacherib, the ultimate place to conquer was Judah. The ultimate place to conquer was to take the city of Jerusalem. Because why? Because in taking Judah and taking the city of Jerusalem, in Sennacherib's mind, he was defeating their God as well. And the only way for him to prove to himself that it wasn't God allowing him to do it was to defeat Jerusalem and Judah and say, there, your God was nothing, it was me all the time. That was the point. And so he said, God said, look, he said, Sennacherib, I'm going to put my hook in thy nose. You think about it, I mean, they do it to pigs and stuff like that. But you think about, if you just, yesterday I was digging in something, I was looking for something, and Brother Jay, I just stuck my hand down in there, and I got boys, so this kind of stuff happens. Fortunately, it was me that did it, not their mom or their sister. But I stuck my hand down in something, and it was a fishing lure in there. And it stuck in my finger. I'm like, and I pulled the drawer the rest of the way open and pulled the thing out, take the fishing lure off my finger. But you think, Brother Jay, if that fishing lure wasn't in my finger, if that fishing lure was hooked in my nose and you just tug just a little bit, you know what I'm going to do? Wherever you tug, I'm going to go. Because why? I don't want that thing doing any more stretching on my nose than it's already going on. And God said, I'm going to put my hook in your nose. And once I put my hook in your nose, it's not where you want to go anymore, Sennacherib. It's where I tell you to go. Whichever way I pull the string, that's where you're going to follow. He said, I'm going to do that. And he said, I'm going to put my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back. He said, guess what? You already lost the fight. You already lost the fight. Why? Because you raged against me. That's why you lost the fight. You decided that the tool was greater than the man running the tool. And in verse number 29, it switches. Again, it switches. And so now God is now back to talking to Hezekiah. And this shall be a sign unto thee. You shall eat this year such things as grow of themselves, and in the second year that which springeth of the same, and in the third year you shall sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof. You got to think, we're just going to look at the number of 185,000, but you got to think, if they've surrounded them, Brother Jay, whatever fruit was in the field was being eaten up. You got a 185,000 man army outside your walls. Guess what? They're going out in the fields. They're picking every apple off the tree. They're picking every grape off the vine. They're eating every fig. They're wiping it out. And here's Hezekiah, and no doubt God read his thoughts, and his thoughts were God. If we don't get defeated by the army, we're going to die of a famine because they've done ate everything. And God said, hey, he said, I want you to understand. He said, I've got fruit that'll grow of themselves. It's not stuff you've planted. It's not stuff you've planted. It's stuff that I had planted for this specific day. Those seeds fell. We all have volunteers. If you drive down 136 from where Brother Hollis lives towards the camp right now, when you drive down through there and you look in the field on the right where there used to be an asphalt plant there is one sunflower. There is one big yellow sunflower in that field. They planted them sunflower seeds, them sunflowers in the spring, Brother Jay. and they dried up, and they look terrible, and they were harvested, and now there is one beautiful little yellow sunflower in that field when you drive by that field. Bub noticed it the other day too. I'm like, did you notice that one sunflower? He said, yes, I did. Well, what happened right there? It planted itself. They come through and they harvested, and that thing fell to the ground, and it planted itself. And God said, I've got fruit. I've got food for you that you look out to that field and say, we planted that field, we did all that work on that field, and they've destroyed it. And God said, hey, he said, I've got food for you. I've got food for you this year, and I've got food for you next year. It's going to happen again next year. You're like, man, we got to get out there, and we got to get the ground tilled, and we got to get a new crop in. God said, no, I've got it for you. I've got 2 years I've got you taken care of. And in the third year, he said, sow. He said, sow and reap. Plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof. He said by the third year, things will be back to normal. You'll be settled back in. And in that third year, you can go out, you can sow, and you can sit there and look for your harvest to come up, because that's how I've got this. I have got this. I mean, how many times when you pray are you just waiting for God to say, I've got this? You know he does. You know in the back of your mind, you know he does. But once he tells you, hey, I've got this. I can handle this. I've got this. I knew this day. I knew this day was coming, and I knew what your concern was going to be. And because I knew what your concern was going to be, before you even mentioned your concern to me, because again, he just laid the letter on the altar. He didn't talk to him about, hey, how are we going to eat? But I want you to understand that I know what your concern is going to be, and I want you to understand that I've got that covered as well. Thank you.